Recording in progress.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Art of Armor, the Zoom video conference of all things armor to benefit History Live Northeast. I'm Matt Blazek, Executive Director of History Live Northeast, and we're getting ready to start our third session of the day. And here we have artist and reenactor Andy Volpe. He's going to give us a talk about images of Roman armor, but not what you might expect. So he's going to share his screen. I'll let him introduce himself, and he can take over.
Alrighty. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So yeah, my name is Andy Volpe, and I've the presentation has kind of gone a little off course than I originally intended. It's the typical thing. You start down one rabbit hole, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, I need to include this. And, oh, I need to include that. Blah blah blah. So, originally I titled it as just 16th century, but I've expanded that a little bit to look at artwork from earliest depictions of like foreign armor and things like that, and Roman armor, all the way through to 1600s. So I kind of like my background really quick. So as Matt mentioned, I'm an artist by trade. I have a degree in art, and in art history classes in college, we're learning about the Renaissance, the revival of Earth in Greek and Roman, and that eventually led me towards studying more about Roman stuff. And then after graduating, I ended up at the Higgins Armory Museum in Worcester. And at the time they came to me, I was also studying HEMA. So I was studying Joachim Meyer and some of the fencing manuals with Dr. Forgang and some of the other people you see here in the chat, like Kent and some other people. And but they came to me and said, well, you're really big into Roman stuff. How would you like to wear armor and do a presentation? I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. Where do I sign up? So I developed that around 2001. I've been giving programs on that ever since. The museum unfortunately closed in 2013, but it moved to the Worcester Art Museum, and we continue to give arms and armor programs there on a fairly frequent basis. I also do a lot of work for the Museum of Printing up in Haverhill, Massachusetts, where we've acquired a substantial collection of prints dating mostly from about 1493 is the earliest one to about actually about 1960 is the most recent, but the majority of it is the 15 and 1600s woodcuts and engravings. So I've been going through that collection for the last 2 years, and I keep coming across these images like you see on the screen with German on it, or Roman Latin names and things like that. I'm like, huh. So it's kind of interesting timing that Matt came to me and said, hey, you want to do a presentation? And I'm like, yeah, could put something together. And then you also see me listing the printing office of Eads and Gill. So since about 2010, I've been working on replicating the engravings of Paul Revere as copperplate engravings, all done by hand, just as he did in Boston. So without further ado, I want to kind of go over a couple of considerations, both for my layout for this program and kind of in general. When I got into Roman Legion living history around 2001 with Higgins, and also talking to Matthew Ampt with Legion 20 down in Maryland, there was Gladiator had come out, and so of course I saw that movie and I was like, oh, I want to do Romans. And then, the deeper I got into the research, the more I realized that the movie wasn't doing that great. So, with accuracy. Oh, Matt's even on. Oh, that's awesome. Hi, Matt. I just checked the chat there. I might as well leave that up. So anyway, so some considerations when you're looking at quote unquote Renaissance in Hollywood stuff, especially with the artwork in the Renaissance period and early modern period. You have to consider the time period that the work was made in versus the time period or the historical event being depicted. I think there's a difference. Historical accuracy is another factor. You want to make sure that the stuff that we think we know about today in terms of historical actually is different from what they knew back then. I often say in my public programs and school programs, because I do these Roman programs for schools and libraries and even some colleges. What I knew 20 years ago is completely different from what I know now. They've actually uncovered more stuff in the last 20 years than what we've known about for the last 50 or 60 years. So there's always something new to learn. And Hollywood, unfortunately, is going to be always playing this game of catch up, where we come up with new information that literally rewrites the history books on a fairly frequent basis. And you made this epic blockbuster movie 10 years ago. That information may not hold water anymore. So that's something you need to consider, trying to use period illustrations for your research or reenactment or reconstructions and stuff like that. You also want to look out whenever you see like weird or exotic looking weapons, tons of spikes, armor with faces on it, and creatures, wings, things like that, shields with faces on it. That can be an indication that what you're looking at in the artwork is depicting something from the classical period or from like biblical sources or things like that. You'll also see a formulaic or a thematic layout to artwork spread across, like 200 years between 1400 and 1500. The artwork is kind of going to look the same. It's the same thing that Hollywood does. You've got your cookie cutter Roman, Hollywood Roman in leather armor. They're working from the same prop closet that everybody else has been using. So you end up with this standard look. There are other things too, like in the Renaissance, they're taking their cues from vase paintings and actual classical pieces. Things like Hercules. You almost always see him depicted both in the ancient and in Renaissance holding a club, usually with the lion pelt on him, and he's ripped. That's pretty easy to identify. So it's like, oh, that guy, that's probably Hercules. David and Goliath, which, as you can imagine, are hugely popular in the Renaissance and early modern period. David is this scrawny little dude with a sling, and Goliath is this jacked behemoth with insane armor. And that's part of the narrative. That's part of the story. And of course, we always like to say the more things change, the more they sort of stay the same. So again, why does Hollywood keep getting it wrong? We can't just keep blaming Shakespeare, with his Julius Caesar play and things like that. The Hollywood blockbuster, like I said, if it worked really good for Gladiator, then my movie has to, take a one step, level 11. But I'm also a cheap, producer, so I'm going to just use the same props that they did because, well, it worked good for them. At least, I could be on my soapbox all day long about that. Interestingly enough, because I was, like I mentioned before, with that repetitive narration, in the Renaissance, that muscled cuirass sort of look is seen over and over and over again for I'm just going to delete the chat there just to keep it out of my way. Sorry. We see the same, we see a formula going all the way back to the Renaissance of a typical Roman, and it's an easy way to identify them. So they're working with what they have available to them. Some of the Roman sculptures, like the Trajan's Column in Rome, is still there. The Colosseum is still there. It's not looking so good in 1550, but you know what I mean. They're still looking at the stuff. They're still reading about this stuff. So there you go. That whole idea even goes back to antiquity. If you look at the Praetorian Guard, they're often written as wearing antique or obsolete armor, like this traditional look. Roman cavalry had a war game called Hippogymnasia, where they were wearing "quote unquote" Amazonian looking gear. It's like almost like the shirts versus the skins in these sports that the military played. One side dressed up as the bad guys, Well, what do the bad guys look like? I don't know, make them look crazy and badass. Yeah, it's nothing that's not familiar to us today. And the European fanboys, shall we call them, antiquarians and whatnot, were they getting it right? What were they looking at? What were they basing their stuff on? And once they get to the images, I think that might be a little more clear. And again, historical accuracy, our idea of what, or our definition of accuracy has only been defined in the last 50 years, really, when you think about it. I've got a couple of books of lectures dating back to like 1895, talking about Roman auxiliaries, and they're talking about leather armor. And it's like, it's based on nothing. I see the sculpture and obviously he's wearing leather armor. It's like, you can't tell that from the sculpture. The paint has been stripped off after 2,000 years. So you got some of those things going on. Classical texts and printing is a big deal. Polybius, Tacitus, Josephus, Vegetius, Julius Caesar, stories about Vespasian and Trajan. These are the great Roman heroes of their time period. Interestingly enough, when you look at it in a broader sense, if you look at like the 1450s, what's going on? Constantinople is 1453. The Germans are fighting the Polish and the Turks in the 15 teens. So who better to study than somebody like Alexander the Great or Emperor Trajan, who fought, the Scythians and fought the Persians. You're fighting the same kind of people. So, what were they doing? What can we take notes of today in the 1500s? David and Goliath, the big story of the little guy defeating the big guy. Hint, hint. And of course, Vegetius is a major textbook for this stuff too. The epitome of the Roman army. It's like, if you want your army to be like it was in the heyday of the Roman Empire, you do ABC. Though, there's some consensus today in the last 10, 15 years now. And I'm kind of in that school of thinking, is that Vegetius is a criticism of the army in the Diocletian period. But we can go on a rabbit holes for days. I'm going to try to keep it into the Renaissance in the 1500s. Charles the Bold of Burgundy in the 1460s and 70s was obsessed with Julius Caesar, and his model of his army is essentially designed in the same light as the Roman army that he was reading about. And of course, Renaissance being the rebirth of everything Greek and Roman. In the early modern period, they may not necessarily have known any better from what they were looking at or what they were basing it on, who, 200, 300 years before them, what they were writing about. They probably assumed that, well, the antiquarian in 1490 obviously knew what he was talking about Romans. So I'm just going to use his information. And a lot of these translations of like Tacitus and Livy and Polybius that are done in the 1600s, they were translations into the current languages like English and Dutch from the Latin. So there's some translation errors too that we're looking at today. All right, one more slide of blah, blah, blah. The printing press, since I work at a museum about printing, I'm kind of into this stuff. Nicholas Jensen in 1472 creates the first Roman or humanist typefaces, much like the one you're reading right now. He's looking at Rome. He's looking at the inscriptions that are still there on arcs of triumphs and things like that. He's also credited with creating some of the first Greek typefaces. It's not to say that the Greek alphabet wasn't around, it's just, it wasn't put into type that you could put into a press and print from. William Caxton sets up in 1476. He caused a stir because he was making English translations of classical works. He is also sometimes credited in modern terminology as creating the first paywall, where by subscription, you would get like the first 5 pages of his history of Troy, but if you wanted the rest of it, you had to pay for it. And that would give him hopefully enough time to translate it on the fly and print it and publish it. At least that's what we think is going on with Caxton. The Aldine Press with Aldus Manutius, he published Aristotle. Obviously philosophy was a big deal in the 1500s. Virgil was a huge title. the Plantin Press, which technically operated until 1847, all sorts of classical texts. And lastly, to mention quickly, and part of this was from that Klein collection at the Museum of Printing that I've been going through, I've been finding a bunch of Sebastian Munster's cosmography, which are translations of Pliny and Herodotus of biblical times up to the modern age, in his time period, the 1550s. And that was continuously printed until the 1630s. On a very quick side note, I found a couple of sheets from this cosmography that mentions of the land Canada and of the land Mexico. So, which was pretty cool to see, stuff like that. All right, so on to the images. So we're going to start with Della Francesca in 1436 with his idea of the resurrection. And you notice these quote unquote Roman soldiers. You notice this guy here with the spear, SPQR, is on a shield. By the way, SPQR is a complete invention. We don't really see that as an official Roman thing. Somebody like Evan out there will probably can talk more about that. But again, I'm glossing over kind of quickly here. I don't have a ton of time to dig into this. But anyway, SPQR, Roman soldiers. Notice this guy here, he's got these terges, these flaps, this fringe on his shoulders. And this guy with the fuchsia colored helmet looks suspiciously like a Apollo Corinthian style helmet. Like here you see with the famous face painting of Achilles and, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. Is it Agamemnon? Achilles and Ajax. And they've got their helmets pushed up on their heads, which was a very popular thing to do. The Romans in the Punic Wars and a little bit earlier took that idea and made that into a helmet to look like as if it's a helmet pushed up on their heads with these little vestibule eyes and nasals on the helmets. And then if you look at the Barboot helmet from Milan, they're looking at Greek and Roman helmets, I'm pretty sure. And again, I'm not going to dive too deeply into the evolution of 15 and 1600s arms and armor. It's a whole other topic. Here's an actual sculpture from the Roman history, the Ahenobarbus sculpture. And it's really difficult to tell. And I apologize for these slides. They're horrible. Some of them I've had for like 10 years and they're just not that good anymore. But anyway, especially when you blow them up. He's wearing an Apollo Corinthian on his head. And here's an italic, what we call an Attic style helmet from the very late Roman, Greek period. So, you're starting to see these elements in the artwork. My best example, and this is going all the way back 20 some odd years in the college and art history classes looking at this stuff. We bring up, the art teacher brings up the painting of the Eisenheim altarpiece by Grunewald. And here's Roman soldiers. It's like, this isn't a Roman soldier. There's no way that this is a Roman soldier, but was Grunewald aware of what Roman armor looked like? Did he care? Or was he using armor that was considered obsolete in his time period? This armor, obviously in the 1440s, 100 years later, they had switched armor completely. So do you take parts and put it together? Is this a visual narrative in the 1500s for people looking at this who don't know about arms and armor from 100, 200 years before they lived? Oh yeah, that's totally a Roman soldier. Sure, yeah, why not? Because he looks old. This could be a thing. This is at the Worcester Art Museum. And I again apologize for the blow up on the slide. I've had this picture for years. If you look at this helmet and you look at the helmet that I'm wearing, I used to wear this, what's called today an Aquincum type eye. They look kind of similar. And if you do get a chance to go to the art museum and you look at this painting for real, this ear hole is like 3 or 4 inches ahead of his ear. So, did the painter who painted this know of a Roman helmet that was dug up? Was it in somebody's collection? Did they see it on a sculpture like Trajan's column and said like, oh, okay, here's a Roman helmet. I'm just going to paint one onto this dude here. Also notice that this shield, this square scutum shaped, interestingly enough, with SPQR on it. are these bad interpretations of actual artifacts, or are they based on an artifact and they're not just quite getting the details right because they don't know any better and they don't care? This one's also missing cheek pieces. And that's what we find archaeologically, even today. We find a bunch of helmets without cheek pieces, though we know from sculptures and we know from other artifacts that they had cheek pieces. And if any of you are on the HEMA board on Facebook, I saw this guy show up actually a couple of weeks ago, and I said, I need to grab that image because that looks familiar. Because if you look at the brow guard here on the top of the helmet of Roman helmets, which is very typical, I'm wondering if they're like looking at Roman helmets and then kind of piecing this thing together. And then, of course, Higgins Armory collection and other collections of arms and armor have these helmets. And I just went quickly looking when I saw this image, and sure enough, this popped up. I'm like, oh my gosh, they're like the same time period in the same kind of helmet with these visors. My Roman Legion group, Legion 3 Kyrenaika, when we do like archaeology fairs and just hands-on stuff for kids, 9 times out of 10, the kid picks up a helmet and puts it on backwards. Matt, to your normal. So if you're not aware of what's going on, you kind of come up with a kind of a bad interpretation. And I saw this Morgenstern that he's carrying, and I'm like, holy mackerel, that thing is ridiculous. And Higgins Armory had one on display for a long time, and unfortunately that got deaccessioned when the museum closed. And this is from about 1600, I think, is when they dated that. All right, Da Vinci. You might know this guy. He did this fantastic silver point for his masterwork when he was studying under Verrocchio. This helmet is, this is a fanciful helmet. It's got wings on it. It's got all these like floral things all over it. What are they looking at in the time period? It's got a lion. It's got the turgaze. Things that we're familiar with quote unquote Roman. Pardon me. And if you look at actual helmets from the time period, again, these are also from Higgins Armory. They're adding things like Medusa faces and lion faces on things. Though I've discovered that the elements on this helmet might be added more recently, as early as the 1800s. But again, that's neither here nor there. The shape of the helmet is what I'm interested in, which looks suspiciously like this quote unquote Roman helmet of what we call today the Burgundian Morion, or the Burgonnet, whatever you want to pronounce it. And of course, I have to include my hero, Albrecht Dürer from 1505, with this crazy helmet with this little flip up here on the helmet. I'm not entirely sure what's going on with that, but it's an interesting, fantastical helmet that sells the point that this is an exotic, antique, antiquarian, classical helmet. Then we've got things like face pieces on helmets. This is an engraving of a copy of Rubens's copy of Da Vinci's, which may or may not have actually been painted or painted over or lost. We're not sure what the story is. But I threw this up here because, we read descriptions about the Romans from like Polybius and whatnot, and they describe things like they had faces on their helmets, or they dig them up, like in Calcresa or this one here. That's a pretty crazy looking thing when you see that. And, why not put that on your fanciful helmet to be really badass looking for your fantastical paintings? Trajan's column, of course, is a major source of image sources for us Roman reenactors today. And this goes all the way back to all the way back to the Renaissance. I believe this is from a travel book from around 1590, maybe 1600, something like that. I haven't been able to quite source it or date it yet. Trajan's column images. And of course, I put up the actual column. I just happen to have this in my collection of images. And lo and behold, it's the same. When I found this print in the Klein collection at the museum, it's the same one. I'm like, oh, that's convenient. So yeah, that's where they're getting their information from. And of course, we can also look at actual Roman sculptures that survive. Here's Augustus, that was known as the Prima Porta Augustus statue, which was actually painted. The whole idea of, and I'm sure this is probably common knowledge by now, I hope, that all ancient sculptures were painted heavily. Greeks were doing it, Etruscans were doing it, Romans were doing it, Egyptians were doing it. But after 2,000, 3,000 years, the paint fades away. And you also have knuckleheads like in the 18th, 17 and 1800s who are like, oh, I don't like the paint. It looks ugly, strip it off. So you got problems like that too. Thanks to modern imaging techniques, we can now look at the pigments and figure out, okay, these are painted pretty wildly. The alla Romana or Romanesque style is apparent in armor from the 1500s onwards. And we've got even going back to the 1430s with Jan van Eyck with St. George. Again, you look at the turgaze, this shell shape in the armor. They're taking these elements and applying it to contemporary paintings. So it's a visual narrative. St. George, of course, is quote unquote a Roman officer, a Roman soldier. So what do you do? It's like, well, I want to make them look Roman. How do I do that? Well, we got Roman sculpturary, so I'll just take parts and add it on. How far back does this trend go? I don't know, pretty far. This is from the 1100s, and this is David and Goliath. And I find this one really interesting because this is showing them in contemporary clothing. This is what everybody's wearing in the 1100s. Whereas if you look back in the the Eisenheim altarpiece or later, Jan van Eyck, they're usually what we see in these illustrations is armor from like 100 or 200 years before the time period that I was painted or engraved or whatever. It goes back even further. The infamous Nile mosaic of Palestrina has these quote unquote Romans or actually, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say Romans, Hellenistic or Ptolemaic Greeks that are in Egypt with these helmets that look old for Romans when this was done at the end of the first century BCE. I also, this I know it's hard to see in the image. This squared shield has a scorpion motif on it, and like this one here, which I find interesting. But they have all these round shields, but they're wearing this Greek style clothing. All right, so some more examples in terms of prints and prints specifically. Again, David and Goliath. You can tell this is David and Goliath because David's got the sling and he's small, and we've got Gigantosaur here as Goliath. Again, with that Worcester Art Museum painting, the helmet isn't quite done right because where's his ear? It's back here somewhere. What are they copying from? More David and Goliath. You can tell these are David and Goliath by not looking at the text, even though David shows up here, and that's part of the way I was able to identify some of these prints because some of them are like, what the heck is this about? Obviously, this is David and Goliath. You can tell. I find these two interesting because I think they're about 50, 60 years apart. Both Davids here have blue tunics and boots. I find that just interesting. And Goliath has a red tunic. I don't know. I just find that intriguing. Look, more Romans in quote unquote leather gear. And slight soapbox side slant here. We have the Hollywood Roman with all these arm bracers, which are the most annoying things ever, especially in reenacting land. These people get these crazy ideas from Hollywood, wearing these stupid leather arm bracers. All the images in the 15 and 1600s showing Romans, even in leather armor, don't have these leather arm bracers. They got some pretty ridiculous boots, though we do see large, not just say large, knee length or shin length boots throughout the late Roman period. Just going to start banging through this here. Historical chronicle showing Romans with Roman standards with eagles. They're reading about this stuff. More Romans in what we can tell now typical Roman art. And if you look really carefully at this engraving here, again, they're looking at the Apollo Corinthian style with this Greek face, sort of a Greek hoplite style helmet on top of the head. This particular print mentions Strabo, So it's like, okay, straight, let's talk about Romans. These are not Romans. Why are they wearing 1550 clothing? Again, you don't necessarily know what they were wearing, so you take what was familiar to you, something that the general public can recognize. No images on this one, but has Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra in very large font. This page is about 17 inches, 12 by 17. It's a big book, and this is 1630. And to take a slight divert from Romans for a second here, the use of exotic weapons and exotic armor. Again, and I like this one because this little upturn here on the quote unquote visor makes me think of the Albert Dürer image that we saw earlier. It's got the same upturn on the front of the helmet, but he's got this flail, spiked flail. So, this is what we run into all the time. All of us have stories of, we see the things in movies, and then next thing you know, you go to a Renaissance fair or something like that, and you've got a knight running around with a spiked chain flail. And it's like, well, the movie had it, so this makes sense. No, it doesn't. Putting your enemy with crazy, exotic, badass weapons or weird weapons that only like peasants would use is kind of a mockery thing, if you think about it that way. Shields with faces on them gets interesting too. Where are they getting that idea from? I think they're getting their idea from the Aegis and Medusa shields from ancient Greece. They're reading about these descriptions in narratives and in books, and say like, oh yeah, I want my guy to have this shield with a face on it. Why not? Alexander the Great, as early as Pompey, has an Aegis on his armor. We see it all over ancient and Renaissance artwork. The Nuremberg Chronicle, if anybody knows about the Nuremberg Chronicle, it's a big deal. In 1493, it mentions the New World found in this place across the sea, and it mentions this guy named Gutenberg inventing this machine that prints stuff. I like this page because it talks about the year of the four emperors. It talks about Vitellius and Vespasian. The problem is that they don't know what they looked like necessarily, so they used blocks of other kings from later time periods and just relabeled it as this is Vespasian, even though this block was later used for a priest in like 1320 or something like that, and reused again. These blocks are expensive, and you've already got something like 1,000 blocks for the Nuremberg Chronicle itself. This is the history of the world from biblical times to 1493. So you tend to reuse blocks. So this guy here of this awesome, great looking Gothic harness, or what we call today Gothic harness, of course. This is reused for ancient Romans, and it's used later on for 1470s, 1490s. Another plate, this I believe is from the History of Rome of Livy, from about 1550. They're wearing 1500s plate harness. They didn't wear that in the first century of Roman history. They didn't necessarily know that, but they want the audience maybe to understand, like, oh yeah, armor is eternal. The Aeneid is, of course, really popular reading in Virgil's works, are really popular in the 1500s. They're not wearing this clothing in Virgil's time period, but make it so people can recognize it today. They can they're familiar with it. They can relate to it. They probably saw the nude sculptures of great gods and goddesses. So like, well, we're just going to do the same thing. And another image that goes all the way back to my time in art history classes in college is Mantegna, who loved Roman stuff. He lives in Rome, so he's got plenty of source material. He got nice triumphal arches all around him, and he's got this Roman soldier, quote unquote, arresting St. James. And I see this sword, and we're talking about this in art history classes, and say like, wait a minute, I've seen this before. And we're talking about art history. So you look at Castagno in 1448 of Pipo Spano, like, look at that sword. It's got this clipped off end to it. So, it looks familiar. And again, I think the idea of the dagged fringe um, are an inspiration from Turge's, from Roman sculptures. And I again apologize for this image of the tombstone. He's wearing what we think is probably a scale armor. This crosshatch pattern is on the sculpture, and I think that helps influence things like padded jacks that we see in the 1500s. And if you notice this guy in the background here, interestingly enough, Donatello did it earlier. You got a couple of decades between these two between these two pieces of work, and 20 years later, I'm putting this slide together for you guys, and I'm looking at this guy, and I'm like, wait a minute, I know where this is from. And I remembered back in ancient art history class, there was this Donatello statue, and sure enough, here's St. George wearing quote unquote Roman armor, at least the 1415 version. I was really tempted to put a colored headband on his head, but I thought better of that. I've got 11 things here in the chat. I'm gonna have to clean this up soon and get to answering questions. Triumph of Caesar, again, Mantegna, which is later copied. You've got the triumphal stuff going on here. They're looking at the sculptures. Goltzius, the absolute master of engraving. He did it. He was commissioned to do a book about the heroes of Rome. And this particular image of Torquinius from the kingdom period of the Romans, we're talking like 600s BCE. He had a lot of leeway for what we could create. What I find interesting about this too is that he chose to put a circular shield for Torquinius here. The eagle pommeled sword does show up in actual Roman swords for officers, I believe around the 300s. AD, not necessarily BCE, but they didn't necessarily understand the difference between the Republic Roman period and like the late Empire. But anyway, the ancient Romans in the 600s were basically Greek hoplites with circular shields. And I find that really intriguing that he decided to use that imagery. Those of you familiar with Fecht book will know Joachim Meyer. I did a lot of work with Dr. Jeffrey Forgang at Higgins and Kent and some of the other guys that are out there about this stuff. Again, when I was searching through images that I had, I saw this crest, and all of a sudden I just happened to see it. Here's this Roman character. It's got the curlicue that dates back to Jan van Eyck, I think. It's got the shoulder pieces of Trajan's column. It's got these crazy Roman, ancient Roman boot sort of thing going on. Bare feet. The Caligae, indicative of the Caligae. And again, that Attic style helmet, I think, is influencing this. Interestingly enough, they turn the cheek pieces backwards. And we see this again and again. The early modern period, we've got Ludwig of Nassau, who is an antiquarian. He's a Greek and Latin nerd. And he reads about Polybius and Tacitus, writing about, I'm sorry, not Tacitus, Aliens, Tactica, talking about the countermarch. He's like, oh, wait a minute. This would totally work for muskets that take, 50 steps in almost a minute to load and fire. So the front row fires and retreats back. The second row fires and retreats back or forwards. They can do it in both directions because Alexander the Great and Aliens Tactics talks about that. And I love this image. This goes all the way back to the earliest days with Higgins Armory Museum and the Sword Guild. I see this image of a sword and shield and target, sword and target man. And I'm researching all this Roman stuff, and there's this guy from Mainz from the 1st century in almost identical posture. So you can start to see where they're getting their ideas from. And speaking of Matthew Ampt, here he is in his fantastic Macedonian gear, panoply. I love the top portion here of the English translation by Brigham of Aliens Tactics, because it has Alexander the Great and his Macedonians handing the sword of military knowledge to the English in 1616, wearing 1616 gear. And if you look really quickly at this, you can start to see where they might be getting their ideas from. And as we know, throughout arms and armor history, the fashion dictates the style of the armor. The armor is supposed to look like the clothing that they're wearing every single day, just happens to be made out of metal. And I find that interesting with the tassets and the pleating, especially in the breeches that they're wearing in the 1600s, looks a lot like the turges in Greek and Roman work. The ballista, they're looking at Vitruvius, or maybe this is Vegetius describing bolt throwers. None of these are illustrated in the ancient writings, so they're having to come from an image based on the verbal descriptions and the written descriptions that they're reading. Pardon me again. And of course, we got another Da Vinci with this gigantic, ridiculously sized crossbow, or a ballista. Another side note with Da Vinci, what I find interesting about him is that he gets commissioned to design these weapons of war and to write them and to sketch them down. Some of the current thinking is that he made these ridiculously insane weapons, as an intimidation factor. Like if the enemy got a hold of his sketchbooks, they'd crack it open and see this thing. They say, "Holy crap, we're boned." They've got these machines that they've designed and built, at least a theory. The infamous Notitia Dignitatum was not illustrated in the 400s or 500s whenever it was written, but it was illustrated in 1553. And I love the title page of this. And I happen to find these 3 pages in this Klein collection at the Museum of Printing. And when I saw them, I saw Magister Scrinomium, and I was like, wait a minute, I know where this is from. And I got really excited. And I love this because it has books and it's got scrolls together. I just love that. And you've got these crazy, fantastical creatures. This is probably something like the Hydra. They're reading about the great myths and stories of the Greeks and Romans. So it makes a good story. And this goes all the way into the post-Renaissance Raphaelite, into the neoclassical, like I say, putting the classical and neoclassical. Here's the infamous awesome painting of the Oath of Haradi, who existed in the 600s, taking their oath with not Roman-looking swords, but that's what they had in the 1700s, or at least what they thought the Romans had. And if you look at those helmets, and you look at these guys, the infamous Praetorian relief, I wonder where they're getting their information from. I find that absolutely fascinating. When you see these things, when you see it, like those image puzzles on the Facebook. Also keep in mind too, the Pompeii excavations were quote unquote discovered or started in 1743. This is David in 1780s. So this information is hot stuff. American Revolutionary War, the British Empire is all basing all their stuff on the Romans. The Americans, the Patriots are obsessed with Cincinnatus, who gave up his plow. He went back to his plow after fighting and was voted consul, that sort of thing. Even the fasces, the bundle of rods and the axes representing Roman law and order, shows up on Abraham Lincoln's tomb, on his throne. Not his tomb, his memorial, you know what I mean. The Grand Army of the Republic, they're taking notes from the classical period. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I will go back to, nope, go back, how do I, stop share, there we go. I'll bring up the chat-orama and see what damage I've caused. All right. Yes, Matt, it is your fault. And thank you for joining. I wasn't expecting to see it. That's great. Talking about Vegetius or Wigetius, however you want to pronounce it. Oh, Chalka style Barbuda. Interesting. I didn't know that. That's great. Yep. Yeah, I wanted to include those, but I had so much to go through, and I had all the prints that I had looked through. Yeah, there's so much. I originally designed this to be like a kind of like a guide. It's like when you see these things in other artwork, you'll be able to kind of visually identify like, oh, okay, I see where they're going with this. Oh, I'm gonna have to take a look at that with the Varangian bra. Interesting. Oh, this is great. Yeah, my knowledge of Byzantine and late Roman arms and armor is pathetic. Evan is really good with this stuff, and I appreciate his patience with plugging in all this stuff. Yeah, and pickle. Oh yeah, the pickle hub is definitely influenced from medieval design or Renaissance designs. There's a French fireman's helmet that looks just like a bassinet. No, sorry, not a bassinet, Burgonet. Yep, yeah, reused woodcuts. Yep. I think I did mention that when I got to the Nuremberg Chronicle. If there's any verbal questions, yeah, I'll take them too.
I've actually got one for you, Andy.
Oh yeah, yeah, Farnese Hercules. I wanted to put that up there too. Oh, I love that engraving. Yep, good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah, I agree with Kent that the Romans were kind of a following set of rules. Yep. All right, Matt is Matt up? Is he asking a question?
Yeah, I had a quick question for you. It's kind of interesting, like the tricks and things people use in order to create foreignness in the perception of their viewers in media. One of the things that I see in American media is, when portraying the ancients, oftentimes they'll be speaking English in a British accent in order to create, just enough dissociation that, oh, this isn't a bunch of Americans LARPing, it's like something different.
Oh,
do you find that the artists portraying Roman characters in antiquated but still contemporary armors to be doing the same thing as that? Or is that just a coincidence?
That is a fascinating, that is a good question. Maybe I'd have to look at, that never occurred to me before. Yeah, now when I go back and look at some of that stuff, I'll try to keep that in mind. Thanks for that. That's great. Yeah, I think so. I'm gonna go back and share if that's okay. I want to go back to Da Vinci. I hope everybody can see. I'll just go to big play here. Those of you who are familiar with Renaissance art know of the Colleone sculpture that Verrocchio does, the equestrian statue. I think, based on the look of this guy, of this face, that Da Vinci is doing a idealized portrait of Colleone. Colleone lived in what I think it was the 1430s, and he's making him into a Roman general, kind of like Trajan or something like that. He's adding, lions and Romanesque features, and he puts this Romanesque helmet on Colleone, who's kind of like a local hero, a local war hero, in the same light that like Julius Caesar is like the war hero, even of his time period. I think that this is a possible portrait of Colleone. And those of you who don't know, Verrocchio was Da Vinci's master. So Da Vinci was working on this while he was learning from Verrocchio, and Verrocchio, of course, is working on the statue of Colleone. Coincidental, but I think interestingly enough.
Andy, I've got a question again.
Okay, go.
Ken.
Hi, Ken.
I'm remembering that I've seen I think a mosaic supposedly depicting Alexander the Great in a helmet that looks like a lion's head with his face showing out of it.
Yes.
Is that the Romans trying to make, because they were like a few hundred years after Alexander the Great, was that them making it up, or is there some existing archaeological evidence for there being that kind of maybe one-off kind of a helmet? But
I'm not sure. It would take me a while to search through my computer here. I think I might have the image because I did actually do an illustration of it. There's a helmet in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I did a drawing of it for Dr. Ken Monshine for his Game of Thrones analysis book. There is a lion-faced salet or salet in the Metropolitan with this paper mache or this molded lion face on it. You know, they had to have been taking a note from something. And I think that mosaic does date back to the yeah. So they're probably like, oh yeah, I want that on my helmet. I want to evoke either it's either Hercules or possibly Alexander the Great. Yeah, that's
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Oh, Evan mentions Hellenistic pikemen. Oh yeah, Caracalla, gotta love him. Yes, and Parker also mentions the word legion is our term legionary or legions comes from Napoleon, who was also obsessed with the Romans and tried to create his army in the same light. Yeah, we see this theme over and over and over again of using the term legion. Right now, a whole legion of my finest troops are waiting for your friends. Yeah, on the moon. Star Wars nerd. Any other verbal questions? I'm gonna keep looking through the chat questions here. Oh, I think I'm up to date on that. All right. Well, sounds like I did enough damage. I hope all you guys enjoy that. Yeah, this is
Andy,
oh yeah, there we go. Excellent. Yep.
There
There we go.
talking about.
There we go. Yep. I basically use that as my basis to draw the illustration for Dr. Ken for. Yeah. I got a couple of illustrations out there. Dr. Bill Short with his Icelanders of the Viking Age, and he reused some of the images for Men of Terror, his most recent, and Dr. Ken Monshine. So a lot of them are Higgins Armory armors or pieces and swords and things like that. That was actually kind of a fun project too, and on a side note, because it was like bringing me right back to like early college doing D&D campaigns and drawing fantasy swords and shit in my notebook and stuff like that. So it's kind of like a nice, like, oh yeah, I mean, you look at Talhofer, you look at Da Vinci, they're doing the same thing. They're creating these ridiculous looking weapons and things like that. You gotta love it. And you can find me online for questions later on or correspondence. I'd love to hear from you. And like I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. So I hope the presentation kind of gave you a sense, like when you see this guy in ridiculous armor, like, oh wait, it got lions on it. It's like, okay, I think I see where this is going with that.
All right. Well, Andy Volpe, thank you so much for joining us today for that great presentation. I have one more question for you, the most important question of the conference. What is your favorite armor?
Can you narrow it down to what century? What time period?
Well, you're primarily known for your Roman stuff and the Roman reenacting. So what's your favorite Roman armor?
Well, the Corbridge Horde is a box of broken bits, including about 4 or 5 sets of the infamous Lorica Segmentata armor. That was discovered in the 1960s. And that was like the pivotal moment when we had actual armor from the Romans that looked a heck of a lot like the stuff that they were seeing in sculptures, like Trajan's Column is the most famous one. So then it was like, okay, now we've actually got something. And when Dr. H. Russell Robinson finally came up with the reconstruction that worked correctly, that's what kind of cemented Roman reenacting as far back as the 1960s, 1970s. When it's like, okay, we can actually use this. But the armor in the box itself, all of the broken bits in there, is endlessly fascinating to look at it from a idea of engineering and design. And I think the armor, the Segmentata armor itself, is designed as a modular piece. You can take a broken part of the shoulder piece, the whole shoulder assembly off, slap on one that looks close enough, and throw the broken one in the repair bin, and you can repair it later. Corbridge A patterns from Armor Archives. Yeah. And I've got the PDF. I've got a PDF of the original English Heritage one. And Peter Connolly. The first book I used was Greece and Rome at War. And Higgins Armory had a copy of that. So that was like my Bible at first. And then I got in contact with that Matthew Amped guy and steered me on the right path. 15th and 16th century armors. Oh gosh, there's a ton. The Higgins Armory has some fantastic ones. You know, that the Teufenbach armor is always up on the top list. I've always liked the Weissenwolf armor that's I think currently on display at the Art Museum now. I don't think it went on the Arms Age of Armor tour that's going on right now. It's a garniture, so you can swap out pieces, and I just find that interesting. You can take out all these pieces, and they all have the same pieces of exchange. I did have at one point like a whole list in my head of favorite ones, but I can't think of it now. I've hit a roadblock, unfortunately, at the moment. I'll think of it at like 3 a.m, like, oh, that's the one I meant to say.
He'll probably text me at 3 o'clock in the morning when he does.
Yeah, if you don't mind. But no, yeah, there are a bunch of ones that I really like looking at. But yeah, in terms of Roman, oh, of course, Higgins Armory Museum, Higgins Armory Collection, Montefortino style helmet from around the 300s BC or maybe the 200s BCE. And Dr. Jeffrey, when we were at the old museum, he got to let me hold it once. And it was an amazing experience. And I'm looking at this helmet, with gloved hands, and I'm trembling. And I noticed this floral pattern in punchwork around the bottom edge of the rim. And I was like, Jeffrey, look at this. He's like, I didn't even know that was on there. And you couldn't see it from the display case because of the lighting and the bad angle. And it's only until I had it in my hands and had it underneath the light and I was staring at it like this far away, I realized what was there. I was like, and Jeffrey's like, well, I got to rewrite the whole condition report on this now, because now it has us that, we didn't even know it was there. I'm like, so that was really exciting. They have a fantastic gladiator helmet. One of the oldest pieces I got to hold when the museum closed was the Egyptian axe, which is about 3,000 years old, 2000 BCE. One of the bronze axes. Bill McMillan, the conservator, he goes up to the case, gives it a good smack to get the plexiglass off because it had a seal on it, and lifts it off. And it was like Indiana Jones. I was like, oh, I was like, oh. So that was a lot of fun. And Jeffrey has talked about it too with some of the bronze, the Mycenaean and bronze swords that the collection has. These are around the same time period as technically as the Trojan Wars, and you're holding on to this thing, and you like the previous lecturer had mentioned, it speaks to you in a lot of ways, and it's like, wow, the stories that this thing could tell is pretty cool stuff. So yeah, I do hope everybody here who doesn't already volunteer or work with the Worcester Art Museum, if you get a chance to come out to Massachusetts, come right to the Worcester Art Museum, check out the display, the Age of Armor traveling exhibit. I'm plugging a museum I only do a couple of things for. Go try to see the armor. It's a great collection. I really want to get out to the Art Institute of Chicago. That was an awesome looking exhibit. I've seen the one in Philadelphia. That was pretty cool, but that was like almost 20 years ago. This whole time I'm talking, I'm trying to think of what my favorite 16th century.
I think it's okay. We're running out of time,
but I think we're out of time.
It's safe to say that you like armor. So do I. Well, thank you again.
Armor, printing, and birds. And hockey.
Well, thank you again, Andy, for doing this for us today. We're going to take a quick break and set up for Dr. Chaska Kirchhoff for her talk coming up. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll be back in a couple minutes.